Hi, welcome to session 10 of the book of Genesis. And today, after our long and careful journey through Genesis 1, we begin a new story, the Garden of Eden story, as it starts in chapter 2, verse 4b, as we call it, the second sentence in verse 4. But there's so much going on in the Garden of Eden story, and it's been used for so many purposes that can mislead us or in our interpretation or mislead us in our lives, that we need to spend this one session just looking at some of the big picture and see what the Garden of Eden story is and what it isn't, and whether it continues from the story before or launches us into something new by a different author that's perhaps contrary to Genesis 1. So let's start where we left off in the verse, and then we'll look at some overview pieces. So we left off here with the first story, as scholars think of it, the first creation story, ending with this sentence, the Toledot generations here, Toledot, of the heavens and earth. They're generations we think of as, one lifespan leading to the children of the next lifespan, but keep in mind the original meaning, which echoes the Greek, to generate, to bring something into being. So as God brought into being the sun and the stars and the moon and the people and the plants and the animals, these are the generations, the generating, if you will, of the heavens and earth. And then we have this, in the day the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now, almost all scholars would agree that the singular day here, as I have note here, Bayom, in the day, is operating in a different mode of being. This is not a literal day with the evening and the morning marking the day of each section, as we saw in chapter 1. As Westermann notes here, it corresponds to the opening words of Enu Melish, and this is from a Westermann who sees that the Garden of Eden story is a traditional Yahweh story, which would be, in his view, as older scholars had it, from the Solomonic Empire 300 years before the time of the Babylonian exile. So we'll see how his comment there is in tension with newer scholarship. As Casuto notes, not a specific day, but a general time reference. Based on what? Well, it's not clear. If we can think of how we use that in English, back in the day, meaning sometime in the past, or in my day, when we mean perhaps my youth or my time of highest power in the world, but we don't mean literally a 24-hour period. So it's very possible that similar meaning in English is what's going on here, in the time period in which Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And now we have Lord God, which means it's the first time we have Yahweh named here. And we'll see that Genesis just assumes that the audience knows the word Yahweh. It's not explained anywhere in Genesis. The most famous explanation is in Exodus 3, when Moses, out there in the desert tending his father-in-law Jethro's flock, comes upon the burning bush and eventually asks the name of this voice, and the name answers, I am who I am. But of course that's the English translation of Yahweh, Asher Yahweh. And so that's in Exodus where we get that explanation. Here in Genesis, it's assumed that somehow the audience already knows. So that's certainly an argument for Exodus being earlier than this text, or at least some text being earlier, so that we can assume the audience knows something from some other source than the immediate word here, which obviously offers nothing at all. So now we have Yahweh Elohim as the name of God here, made the heavens and the earth. And then we have the familiar Garden of Eden story. And so to look at this, we have to first explore some of the things it is and some of the things it's not. So let's first look at what it's not, so we can clear some ground, so to speak. Most commonly, people associate the Garden of Eden story, at least in a Christian world, with something called original sin. But not only is original sin altogether not a biblical concept, it's one that reaches its form of understanding that most people carry with them from Augustine in the 4th and early 5th centuries of the Common Era, so 1,000 years roughly from the time of our exilic composition of Genesis. But the Hebrew word chatat, as you see here, for sin, is not even mentioned until Genesis 4:7, when Yahweh warns Cain that chatat is crouching at the door. And of course, we'll get there eventually. So there's actually nothing about sin in the garden. There's no description that the man and the woman, or even the snake, sinned at all, although they obviously are cursed along with the land, which we'll get to in chapter 3. But whatever that curse is, it's not a punishment for sin. We'll have to clear that out of our heads so we can hear the story on its own terms. It's also not a matter of male superiority or female inferiority. Starting in the 70s and 80s, as feminist scholarship began to get a hold in traditional biblical scholarship, we had texts like Phyllis's Tribble's Texts of Terror, where she tried to unpack and reinterpret texts that had been used in the church against women. And the Garden of Eden story is certainly one of those. And so she started that. But since then, there have been so much incredible work. When we get to chapter 3, verse 16, we'll look closely at Carol Meyer's brilliant translation effort of just that verse, which she wrote a 20-page, closely argued journal article just about how to translate that verse. So we'll see the influence of a lot of female scholarship. We'll also see the influence of a lot of ecological scholarship and indigenous scholarship in a time period where we are aware of our fragile relationship with the earth as climate change bears down upon us through nobody's fault except our own. So our sensitivity to the earth in the last half century or so, perhaps not quickly enough to save us from our fate, but at least has alerted us to aspects of the story that, when we interpret it wrongly, do not aid us in our attempt to live in harmony with this beautiful gift of a planet that God has given us. So we'll see that as we go through. But we'll have to read carefully, and we'll see a little of that in just a moment when we look at the original Hebrew and some word plays about how this is not in any way validating male superiority or female inferiority. And not only that, it's not presenting women as temptresses, which is an interpretation common in the early Christian tradition, not the biblical tradition, which is ultimately not Christian at all, as we'll hear in the seasons of this program that deal with the New Testament, starting with Matthew's Gospel. Where women were interpreted as temptresses to men, especially with people like Jerome in the 4th and early 5th centuries. This story is nothing about that, nor is it based on the King James translation that is so common. Their helpmate is women presented as sort of an assistant, a helper, like in the old style nurse to a doctor, where the nurse handed the doctor the instruments, but the male doctor did the work. Just as nowadays in healthcare, nurses and doctors can be male and female and partners in the care of people, so women and men in the story we'll see were meant to be partners, although it doesn't quite turn out that way because of human choice, not because of what God did. And then finally, what it's not about is the snake as the devil. That's an association that is biblical, but it's not in the Garden of Eden. We'd see that in Revelation 12, where the evil one, the devil, Satan, and the great ancient serpent are all equated. And so that's the only place in the Bible where some animal is associated with the devil and understood to be retrojected back into the Garden of Eden story. But as readers of Genesis, we've just seen that all creation is good, and we didn't see anything about any devil. So not only is the snake part of the good creation, we don't know anything about any kind of devil, and the story doesn't mention it, nor does the Hebrew Bible ever mention anything like a devil. Although it does mention Satan, but only a few times and in very different contexts. So just a few things about what the Garden of Eden story is not about. So what is it about? And again, we have the benefits of modern scholarship, not only feminist and ecological, but also anti-imperial scholarship, to help us understand how this is both a counter story against the Enuma Elish, which we'll look at again in a second, but also an ongoing narrative against empires throughout history. So broadly speaking, it is about humanity's relationship with God, with humanity's relationship with the earth. We'll see the Adam and the Adamah are deeply connected, and with each other, as represented by the two humans who start off as one body, end up as two bodies, and end up alienated from each other, as we'll see. It is certainly a counter story to Babylon's Enuma Elish, and we'll look at that more in just a moment, around the simple point, but profound in terms of how to live, that humans are meant to live by God on the earth, not in imperial cities grounded in surplus agriculture. We who've inherited civilization as sort of the pinnacle of human development might find it difficult to imagine that God intended us to, quote-unquote, go backward to our, quote-unquote, primitive origins. But we'll see how that's exactly what Genesis is calling for, and it's needed more today than ever, as difficult as that may be. And yet there are people who are trying to do that. And so we'll explore that some more as we go. Because of anti-imperial scholarship, and some of that is by one of my former late colleagues, Father Pierre Ely, S.J., and also another colleague, which we'll explore later, a sly satire on monarchy and the temptation of royal wisdom, with the snake not representing the devil, but the wisdom that is whispered into the ears of kings to get them to increase their power over others, as we'll see. And then finally, it's an explanation, and chapter 3, verse 16, and that section of the curses will go into detail about this, of the relationship between patriarchy and agriculture in the world lived by the first audience, which is to say that patriarchy is the part of the curse. That women being subject to male power is not something that God intended, but it's a function of the disorder that comes about in this passage. So let's go back and look a little bit at the relationship with the Enuma Elish. We looked at this chart a little bit when we looked at the very beginning in Genesis 1, but now there are some things that are really important in relation to the Garden of Eden story. So we already saw that in Genesis 1:26 to 28 that human beings were made not to do the below work, the grunt work in the city, but to bear the image and likeness of God. And we began to see about the source of food in Genesis 1 that said you can eat from all the seed-bearing plants and from the trees. But we'll see in this story also how fruit of trees is what's given and agriculture is what ends up happening. And then humans are placed, of course, in the city in Enuma Elish to serve the city. But here are placed not in a city. There is no city yet. But in a garden, but they are now barred from the garden because of human disobedience at the end of the story. And as a relation to that, as we'll see in the follow-up story with the Cain and Abel story and its aftermath, the divine presence in Enuma Elish is in the city, and in Genesis it's everywhere but the city, as we'll see in that story. So a lot to be looking at there. Let's look a little at wordplay, and then we'll look at the structure of the story. So a couple things. Sorry about that size issue. One of the things that we can easily miss in reading the English is how translations cover over some of the wordplay. So when you see that God made a man and from the earth, you miss that what God made is an Adam from the Adamah, this topsoil, which in Hebrew is grammatically female. The ah suffix is female, and this is grammatically male. But neither are a man or obviously the earth as a woman or as a female biological entity, but in this relationship of Adam and Adamah, and we'll see how that plays out. But beyond that, something we can really miss, and all the Hebrew looks like this. Vowels were only used in Hebrew to help people who were new at it, and the Hebrew text did not have, the biblical text did not have vowels. So these three letters here form all these words, including the word dam, which is the Hebrew word for blood. It's first mentioned in the Cain and Abel story here, Abel's blood crying out to God from the ground. Then we also hear how Adom, the word for the color red, although it's only used here, is also the same looking word. And Edom, the place that's associated with Jacob's brother Esau and the Edomites, who were a people who historically lived in that area of Canaan, in this part of Genesis, are also the same word. So when we hear these all together, we'll get to the Adom, Edom part later, but we hear is that a human being, an Adam, is the Adamah with dam flowing through it. That the blood is like liquid topsoil flowing through the human. In other words, in the Hebrew, we can hear how clearly we are earthlings. That we are not just people put on this planet like the planet was a stage or a platform and we might as well be on Mars or the moon or somewhere else. But we are the earth animated by God and walking around and wondering what we're doing here. And we'll see that as the story plays out. The word plays are going to be very important, and we'll point those out along the way. And then finally, the structure issue here. So note I have one way of mapping the story. There's not a right or wrong way to these things. These are only tools to help us understand how the story works. They're not doctrines to agree on or disagree on. If they're helpful to you, great. If not, not to worry about it. I'm not going to try to make an argument for a right way to map the story, just ways that might be helpful to us. So this way is a chiasm. As you can see, it goes A, B, C, D, C prime, B prime, A prime. And we're going to see chiasm regularly throughout Genesis. It's common throughout the Bible. All of John's Gospel is organized around a chiasm. It's the most extreme example of that. But Genesis has many local chiasms in the sense of these couple of chapters, and also very large ones like the Abraham-Sarah cycle from Genesis 12 to 25 is one large chiasm. And what makes something a chiasm is when the beginning and the end are parallel in some way, either verbally or situationally. And then the inner parts also are parallel. So we'll see here in the beginning, it starts with God as the sole actor and humans are passive, and the same thing at the end. In the beginning, it's on the east, and there's the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and here on the east, the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and only here and in A prime. So we'll look at these parallels as we go, but it's important to see for now that there's 7 specific scenes. This plays out like a drama. And it would be easy one to act out with these players along the way. That's one way to look at it. Here are 2 other ways, just to keep in mind that I'm acknowledging there's more than one. Here's one in the most simple way, also chiastic, but just basically around the theme. So it goes from narrative to naming to an etiology, which is to say an explanation for a practice, why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and another one here. So there's that kind of overarching chiasm. Notice it's not parallel to this one in terms of the chapters and verses, so it maps it a different way. And then here's one just not chiastically, just in sequence, that just names a series of steps: the creation of the human, the planting of the garden, etc. So a number of ways to look at the structure of this, which is to say it's a text that's been intelligently and intentionally put together in a particular way, just as the events inside the story, the tree, the rivers, and such, are obviously intentionally placed there by God, by the author. We'll play with that as we go. And then finally, in our overview here, just something about the number 7s. This chart involves more than just our passages, but as we saw in Genesis 1, where certain words were used multiples of 7 times, so also here in this unit, not just the Garden of Eden story unit, but in chapter 2 to 4, which includes the Garden of Eden story and the Cain and Abel story, which is really a subset. One might call it the story of the first family, because then there's a Toledot, a genealogy, in chapter 5, and then in chapter 6 we get to the flood story and Noah and other things. So really the story of the first family is chapters 2 to 4. And scholars who see this in terms of source elements, in terms of priestly and Yahwist, would see this whole section as a Yahwist. So they would also see it as consistently from one author, separate from chapter 1 and chapter 5 that follow. So here we'd see eretz for earth 7 times. We have a new word here, sadeh, for field, which is to say agricultural land, which we'll explore 7 times. Adamah for the ground, that's the topsoil as opposed to the land or earth, the larger area, 14 times. And then curiously, this combination of the Hebrew for garden, gan, and the word for Eden, and the word for east, combined at 21 times. And then the various combinations of the divine name, Yahweh alone, Elohim alone, or Yahweh Elohim together, 35 times. 5 times, 7 times. So between the word plays and the structures and the comparison with the Naomi Elish, we have some good tools to get us to look more closely at this story. And I look forward to jumping into the story with you directly next session. See you then.